Hello everyone and welcome to this panel. I'm Alessandro GILI, Research Fellow at the ISPI Centers for Geoeconomics and Infrastructure. This event is part of the year-long initiative which will lead us to the 9th edition of the Rome Med Dialogues, the annual conference on the wider Mediterranean region co-promoted by ISPI and with the Italian Ministry for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. This year, the conference will take place from the 2nd to the 4th of November. Today, we will try to understand how the evolving trends in the global space sector are affecting the geopolitical and economic dynamics in the wider Mediterranean region. In recent years, as we know, a new global space race has started. The first global space race from the late 50s to the mid-70s was dominated by the leading great powers, notably the United States and the Soviet Union. Today, instead, the space environment involves an increasing number of countries, including the Mediterranean ones. The space race also triggered a great game of alliances with MENA countries that are signing many partnerships with Europe, but also with China, India, and the USA. We could say that besides being an economic and an industrial competition, space has become a key domain for a geopolitical scramble. The other game-changing factor is the disruptive effect of that the private sector could bring into the new space economy. For example, by reducing the cost of access to the space and opening up new possibilities of space exploration and resource exploitation. Moreover, given the reshaping of global value chains and the protection of critical sectors, space will also be part of the more comprehensive industrial competition. Space industrial value chains will be designed and built also by evaluating economic security and geopolitical elements. And for sure, MENA countries have a great potential to attract new space industrial investments, but some infrastructure shortcomings must be addressed. Finally, international alliances are key to shape a new governance and standards for outer space activities. Indeed, the current international customary legal framework, drawing back from the 60s, is unfit to tackle some of the major challenges as sustainability, the rising of a crowded space environment, and the unpredictable prominence played by the private sector. Given this broad and fast-changing international landscape, an enhanced US-space partnership with MENA countries will be key to boost a trade and industrial relation between the two shores of the Mediterranean and to create positive market synergies. Today, we have the pleasure to talk about all these dynamics with two distinguished speakers. Let me introduce them. SIMONETTA di Pippo, Professor of Practice Space Economy at Bocconi University. Thank you for joining us. And MATIJA RENČELJ, Research Fellow at the European Space Policy Institute. Thank you for your kind availability. So let's open our discussion. I will start with 3 questions for each speaker, and then we will have a Q&A session open to the audience. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. I will start with Professor Di Pippo. Professor, given your outstanding expertise spanning from space economy to space governance, I would ask a first broader question about the state of the art and the evolution of space economy, as well as the main trends ahead. So, in your opinion, who is leading this race, and what should we expect from the private sector? And above all, is Europe lagging behind, and how to achieve a new strategic autonomy for the European Union, in particular when it comes to space launchers?
So really, thank you very much for having me in this very interesting event that you organized. And also thank you very much for the question, because this will allow me to give you really a very a brief overview of what I see the space economy, and also the interactions and the intersections between space economy and space governance, as you mentioned, because the two are really interconnected and also extremely linked to geopolitics and space diplomacy in general. So as I'm used to say, what is really important to notice first is that the concept or the definition of space economy dates back in 2012, when the OECD gave the definition, and introduced the definition that we are all using today. And so the space economy is, in a nutshell, let's say the space sector itself, which means the companies developing rockets, satellites, etc., plus all the value which is produced through the use of space-based data and infrastructures. And if we consider this definition, well, and if we use, for example, the figures provided in their space report by Space Foundation, I could use different, experts and analysts in the sector. Let me use the Space Foundation because it's quite solid in the process they use to derive these figures. Well, for 2022, for them, the value of space economy globally, so worldwide, is $469 billion. But most of the analysts are in agreement on the fact that this will become a trillion economy by 2035, 2040. It depends on the analyst, but still. Now, the figures are important, in particular because, in my own opinion, these are underestimated. And the reason is that it's very difficult, as per today, to categorize the non-strictly space sector-related activities, which means that for sure, even if, as I said, we have different figures, more or less around the figures I presented, well, our Space Foundation presented, still is for sure underestimated, because the more we go ahead, the more we have high resolution images, the more the launching costs are going down, so are less expensive. So the more space is really for more and more players, both private and non-private, so public. Overall, we have an increasing number of actors. And so it's also true that, on one side, the orbits, at least around the Earth, are becoming quite crowded, and therefore could also become contested at a certain point in time, but this is another topic. Still, the point is that we see potentially, at least in few areas on the short term and other areas in the medium long term, a strong possibility that big markets will be created and reinforced. Now, one of the points that also you mentioned in your question is the fact that the private sector is really becoming more and more present, in particular in the Western countries, and in particular in the United States. But this movement, let's put it like that, is growing and growing. For sure, if we look at one of the topics or one of the fields on which we have to put a lot of attention is low Earth orbit. In the current situation we have, if we want to talk about the new trends or the few trends for the future, well, what I see in the short term is the fact that currently we have the International Space Station, which is, as we know well, this big space lab in orbit 400 kilometers above our heads, developed by Japan, Russian Federation. I mean, few let's say 10 countries in Europe under the umbrella of the European Space Agency, Canada, and the United States. But this space station, which has been probably one of the best and the most interesting also platform for cooperation at international level in the space field, is now on the way of being decommissioned. And so for the time being, we know that the plans will start. I mean, the plans are as such that in 2028, this station will start to be decommissioned. And so by 2030, it will not be there anymore. But in the meantime, if we talk about race, because this is also one of the words that we have in the title today, if we talk about a space race, well, we know that the Chinese are going quite well ahead with their Tiangong, so the China space station is well functioning in orbit and has been completed just recently. So we expect the Chinese being in low Earth orbit with the public funded, let's say, space station for a long period of time, and in the United States, but also with a lot of other countries, in particular Italy, supporting this a lot on a B2B, with a B2B approach. The commercial space stations, so so space stations developed on a private basis, are really having quite a strong attention, and we count more or less 4 space stations under development on a private basis. Now, the last question that you were mentioning was in a way related to Europe. Is Europe lagging behind? Well, if I have to be very honest with you, I would say that probably some activities in Europe should be accelerated, let's put it like that. More synergies should be found between and among the various member states. And probably what is needed is also, how can I say, a more cohesive and holistic view at European level with a bit of additional, let's say, risk-taken approach. I mean, we really need in Europe to take a little bit more risks, in particular when we talk about launchers, because for the time being, I could say we are more or less 10 years, let's say, behind, due to the fact that on the private, on the private side, in particular in the United States with Falcon 9, but not only, well, and so SpaceX, etc., and the reusable approach, and as we know, Falcon 9 is not the only launcher that has been developed with this new technology. Well, probably Europe should quickly reassess its priorities and its strategic views, and trying to find the synergies that are absolutely needed in order to speed up a new development process. So in a way, I believe that we could use also some lesson learned from other countries and look at the overall global situation, how everything is evolving in order to speed up strategic decisions. Exactly.
So more cohesion and follow the American approach to risk and to...
At least for what is acceptable for the European, let's say,
trade. Of course. Thank you very much. Coming to MATIJA, we know that one of the main challenges arising from the new space race is the need for updated and strengthened governance. The old legal framework governing outer space does not fit the evolving trends and the emerging key role of the private sector. In your opinion, what are the main challenges ahead, especially when it comes to space resource exploitation, and how to tackle them? Will new initiatives, for instance, the Artemis Accords, foster space law evolution, or will they contribute to increase disorder?
Yes, thank you very much, Alessandro. Thank you also for the opportunity and for the invitation to join you for this interaction, and thank you also to Professor Di Pippo for her first answer and her views. I think we could, just go into a discussion for, at least an hour, but I will try and stick to the question, of course, as agreed. But maybe to start off where Professor Di Pippo already started with the size of the space economy and how this fits also in what you mentioned with the sort of emerging key role of the private sector. Indeed, there are these projections that talk about a $1 trillion space economy by 2040, or let's say around that period, which means there is a lot of incentive for investment into the sector. Like the compound annual growth rate, is high in those projections. So this leads to a lot of private investment coming into space. Of course, investment also wants return, right, at one point. So in that sense, what I would maybe highlight first is that when we talk about the key role of the private sector, that's correct, and it is increasing and it is accelerating. Nevertheless, we shouldn't also be blind to the fact that from the very beginning of the space age, the role of the private sector was in a way crucial for governments to pursue their ambitions. And in fact, if we look at the exploitation side of space, so when we talk about communications, Earth observation, in communications especially, the private sector was very present from the early days in the late 50s with AT&T. They were one of the key drivers of early developments in the United States when it comes to communications. And now what we are facing is that, in my view, also this element of exploration, which used to be very much driven by science and by the exploratory quest of humankind, is slowly transitioning to a phase where a part of exploration also includes exploitation. So this is where the resources come in that you alluded to, and of course with an economic prospect that can be derived through resources, certain new challenges emerge, right? And these challenges on one side are probably security-related challenges, because I think they follow economic opportunities, as well as environmental challenges. In that context, indeed, what you mentioned are the 5 space treaties that we all know. So with the foundational one, the Outer Space Treaty. Those texts have been drafted 50 years ago, roughly, some of them a bit later, but I would not say they are outdated. I think they are good in a way that they are quite abstract and they provide high-level sort of a high-level structure for the future of the governance of our activities in space. Nevertheless, of course, they are not adapted to specific realities and specific activities that are unfolding as we speak. So in that context, I think it's no surprise that actors that have a role to play are trying to somehow shape the regulatory and the governance environment in a way that it would best fit them. So we see that on the US side, where the Artemis program is also matched by the Artemis Accords. We also see it recently on the Chinese side, where the International Lunar Research Station is also transitioning to something that would be more into an intergovernmental organization, where the founding partners would have a stronger voice at the table in future discussions on the governance of the station and so on and so forth. Now, whether this will sort of foster evolution, I think it will in some way foster an evolution, in the sense that it's a new impulse, and a new impulse will inevitably lead to discussions. On the other hand, it's, I think, in parallel, this question that you pose on whether this creates a disorder is also a good, it's a good aspect to consider, because even today, within, let's say, the multilateral system of the UN, we have several fora where space is discussed. Of course, we have the UN COPUOS as the main one, based in Vienna, which Professor Di Pippo knows very, very well. But we also have certain discussions related to our use and exploitation of space going on in the International Telecommunications Union, so at their WRC conferences. There's also the process in Geneva with the open-ended working group, for example, that is focused on security challenges. So I think if you gave me a blank sheet of paper, what I would perhaps argue for is, let's say, something that is akin to, a COP for space, like what we have in the climate change ecosystem, where there's this one big event where all the main players come together and join. I think this could maybe lead to a more, let's say, a more prosperous future for all, and a future with less tensions. But I'm not sure the reality is sort of will really reflect that idea in the years to come.
Thank you, Mattia. So we could summarize: no need for radical changes, but building on the existing field and make the necessary reforms. Having briefly analyzed the global trends that drive space sector evolution, I would propose to focus on the MENA region, a regional dimension, as well as the space industrial strategies with other countries. So, Professor Di Pippo, we know that the Gulf region is more and more involved in the space race. In the late May, Saudi Arabia sent the first female astronaut to the International Space Station. And since 2019, the United Arab Emirates has started to focus on space economy and exploration. In your opinion, what are the main pillars underpinning their national strategies, also considering the broader Gulf Cooperation Council? And which international alliances are they forging?
Well, this is really an interesting question, and we could talk about that for 24 hours. But as Mattia was saying, we will try to stick with the minutes allocated. Well, also to leave more room for a question and answer. Well, one important point, if we want to start looking at the situation from the GCC standpoint, so the Gulf Cooperation Council, as you were mentioning. So the countries which are part of GCC are Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, as we all know. Well, among all of this, the only country which in reality started the program in the space field a bit ago, and then stopped talking and working in the field and is now back, is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, in reality, joined the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and as you know, I was director of the Office for Outer Space Affairs. So when I arrived as director in 2014, among the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia was the only one, because they joined back in 2001. And on top of that, I have to mention that the first Arab astronaut was again from Saudi Arabia back in 1985. Now, Sultan bin Salman Al Saud was, by the way, also the son of the king, in bracket. And he was on a shuttle mission just for a few days, so a short mission, not to the ISS, also because at that time the ISS was not yet there. And then he became also, he has been the head of the Saudi Space Commission for a few years, and now is consulting his father. But just to mention that in reality, from 85 to 2001, so that part of in the history until now, or until just a couple of years ago, Saudi Arabia was not really active in the field. In the meantime, I have to say that from my viewpoint, when I was director of the Office for Outer Space Affairs, well, all the other countries which are part of GCC joined the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. In particular, 3 countries in 2015. So Oman, Qatar, and UAE, all of them in the same year. And then we had Bahrain in 2021, so quite recent, okay? So now the point is, what's happening in the Middle East? What's happening in the Gulf that is really pushing the space sector in all the countries? Well, one of the things that I believe is extremely important to mention is that UAE gave really a push to the project, because this is coming really from the top management of the country. So how can I say, there is really a strong political willingness to consider space as one of the fields in which they want to invest for the future. The others are, you know, behind a little bit with respect to UAE. UAE launched a certain number of satellites, even the mission Hope to Mars recently. They selected even now 4 astronauts, and the selection and the responsibility for the astronauts is under the umbrella of the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center in Dubai. The UAE Space Agency was created back in 2014. And currently, the chair of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is an Emirati individual, so Omran Sharaf, that will leave the baton next year, but currently is also the chair of, I mean, UAE is the chair of the committee. So, as you can see, it's not only a question of learning how to develop satellites, but it's also really entering into the political arena and entering into the geopolitical discussion with a certain important role, I have to say. And by the way, this is true for most of the activities they are performing. Well, they have now, at least in UAE, a certain, let's say, responsibility in terms of supervising the projects, but sometimes they have still to rely on expertise coming from partners, which is also good. And it's important to develop step by step the own capabilities, right? Because at the very end, very soon, also UAE will launch a fully developed and managed satellite in the country. It's true that, I mean, sending astronauts to the space station is extremely important. Sultan Al Nayedi, the second Emirati astronaut, even performed the first spacewalk done from, I mean, by an Emirati, or in any case an Arab-speaking individual. One of the points is that, in my opinion, this is part of this, my personal opinion, knowing the region quite well, is that they consider, as it is true for a lot of other countries, by the way, the fact of being particularly evident and present in the field is for them, let's say, nation pride, right? So that to show through this field that the area, and in particular UAE, but also the others, I mean, they're coming, in particular Saudi Arabia, they want to spend a lot of money in the next coming years. So it's important also to underline that. They really want to demonstrate that they have a role in the overall geopolitical discussion. And the Artemis Accords that were mentioned before are also another way for them to be visible, present, and very active in the field. So I see this sparkling environment quite in a positive way.
Thank you, Professor. So Professor Di Pippo underlined the importance of government strategies to push space investment in the Middle East. So Mattia, I will ask you, what could be the role of the private sector in the development of the MENA space industry, and which factors could hinder it?
Yeah, so I mean, thank you for your question, Alessandro, and to Professor Di Pippo also for great talking points. So I will maybe first link a bit to some of the things Professor Di Pippo mentioned. Indeed, it's also what we observe is that the ambition is very much tied to the wider projection of these countries into the global geopolitical context. So it's really, space is just a part of their projection that is more transversal. And in this sense, I think what's maybe notable is when we talk about Saudi Arabia with billions of dollars now planned investment planned for the years to come. For them, this is part of this Vision 2030, right? So in that context, it's not about space. It's not about space, but it's about the future, and just space is part of the future. So I think that's something that's very important for us to also learn from them when we talk about Europe, that they talk about the future in a more, let's say, open way, and they're not afraid to dream big. And I think in that context, that's maybe something that is quite that can resonate strongly with, I would say, especially younger generations in Europe as well. And they're also not the only ones. Of course, we have Oman building a spaceport. Apparently, Bahrain has some ambitions in space. And then I will come to your question, where you say, okay, and what is the role for industry? What we can definitely observe in the Gulf countries is that they do have high ambitions, and they do have public budgets to match those ambitions. We don't yet see a fully mature industrial base for all the ambitions that they are trying to sort of attain. In that context, nevertheless, I am pretty sure that if we will have this talk maybe 10, 15 years from now, they will be close to that capability. And we can also see it in some sectors, for instance, with satellite operators, notably at the beginning with Arabsat, and then in the UAE, we have Yaksat, for example. They are important global players in telecommunications that are space-based telecommunications. So I think when they pursue an ambition, they also are usually fairly successful in delivering on an ambition. Historically, not just in space, their public investments have proved to be fairly successful. Of course, like any investor, you make wrong calls at times. But from an industry perspective, I think there are two facets that we can maybe try and think of. One is the opportunity also for European industry in the Gulf states. So I think really establishing a presence in the Gulf states in order to satisfy the appetites of the public ambition. And in the past, a lot of the ambitions have been attained with the help and with the support of US entities, US industry, US research centers. So I think there is definitely this industrial perspective of how European industry, at least in the short to midterm, can also benefit from the increased ambition in the Gulf. The second strand is perhaps the question of what people call space tourism. So private flights to suborbital space or to space. I'm thinking that, and this is a bit of an exercise of thinking out loud, but it's a region with many high net worth individuals. So a service like space tourism that by nature targets those kinds of individuals could in fact very well be envisaged successful in the Gulf region. So an operator of space tourism flights in the Gulf probably has a better chance of succeeding and becoming profitable than perhaps doing that somewhere in Central Europe, for example, just because of the demography and the social realities in that region. Thank you.
Just one last brief question for you, and I will start with Professor Di Pippo. Professor, looking at the western part of the MENA region, Algeria, Morocco, and Egypt are eager to play a prominent role in space exploration and also to acquire new technologies. Algeria recently signed a space partnership with Italy, but also with Russia. And We know, for instance, that Morocco is focusing on observation satellites, and new industrial space clusters are emerging in the country. Finally, Egypt has recently signed a space partnership with China and India. So, in your opinion, which are the main goals of these countries in the space sector? And above all, how should the EU and Italy boost space cooperation with the southern Mediterranean countries?
Well, the situation in that region, so the country you mentioned, so Egypt, Algeria, and Morocco, the situation is a bit different, in particular also because in Africa, under the umbrella of the African Union, recently the African Space Agency was created. In reality, it was created already a few years ago. There was then a competition among the countries in Africa on which country should have been the let's say the place where the space agency, the headquarters of the African Space Agency, should be located. And already a couple of years ago, and even a bit more, Cairo, so the Egypt was selected to be the host country. But for a lot of different reasons, this African Space Agency is not yet operational or fully operational. So just to give you an idea, the rationale of creating this African Space Agency was, mutatis mutandis, the same that we can have when we talk about the European Space Agency. So trying to federate the efforts of a certain number of countries to be able, yes, still to have some national activities like we do in Europe, but at the same time, for bigger programs, it would be better to have, a bigger and supranational, how can I say, transnational also agency, an IGO, so an intergovernmental organization, able to eventually tackle certain challenges and certain developments better. Now, the intention is still there. The agency is not yet operational. And as I said, is under the umbrella of the African Union. The countries which are in the upper part of Africa and their shores on the Mediterranean are really keen to cooperate with Europe, and we as Italy, strong relationships, at least with Algeria and Morocco, and also Egypt, for a little bit different, but still. And there is a lot to be done in terms of cooperation, because in a way they need to develop certain skills and capabilities, because they don't have yet the full picture under control. And the fact that they sign agreements in bilateral with countries is always good, because the more we are able to facilitate cooperations, the better it is also in terms of geopolitics, not necessarily in the field of space, but more in general. You know that I've been always advocating for space as a platform for diplomacy, and for, trying to be the tool for reaching peace and maintaining a peaceful use of everything, not only space, right? So I do believe that space can really be an important platform for cooperation and peaceful relationships, and the fact that also you have a multilateral environment like the UN. This is also facilitating bilateral relationships, and I see all of this very interesting, because when you don't have blocks, the Western Bloc, the Eastern Bloc, and other blocks in the entire environment, but you are able eventually to try to let's say cross bridges. This is really important for a better future for all of us. So I see all this very positively, also from a diplomacy perspective.
Thank you, Professor. Mattia, back to you. We know that space strategies have a security dimension. In your opinion, how should Europe engage with MENA countries to coordinate efforts and promote a common governance evolution, a common evolution of space governance? And more broadly speaking, how do you assess the risk of replicating current geopolitical tension in outer space? Is there a risk of fragmentation or even militarization with the US and Europe on one side and China and Russia on the other? And will MENA and other emerging countries choose the most convenient side, in your opinion?
Yeah, thank you, Alessandro, and thank you again also to Professor Di Pippo for her answer, which I think gives a lot of food for thought. So you mentioned the security dimension, and I think you were referring previously to the Western MENA countries, and I think historically those countries were very active in space, but very much from a security standpoint. So government communications, Earth observation for national security needs, and as this sort of security environment on Earth is becoming more challenging, I think yes, there is no doubt that this is also felt in the space domain. I mean, both in terms of impacts on civil programs, like what we've seen with the recent cancellation of cooperation between the European Space Agency and Roscosmos on ExoMars, but as well as the lack of Soyuz launches from French Guiana. And I think also it can lead, and I think it will lead to heightened tension in space, especially if we bring back the idea that we developed early on, that also there will be more and more economic opportunities. I think it's the perfect, in a negative way, mix of circumstances that can lead to more security challenges in the space domain. I nevertheless do share the view that it is an opportunity for European diplomacy as well as for European industry to try and be a stronger actor in this domain, and to also be aligned with Europe's recent tradition of being a peace builder, a peacemaker globally. But I think it's inevitable that we can only do that if we are strong enough, and if our ambition, and also if the implementation of our ambition follows, is strong enough to have a strong word when it comes to the future governance and future relations in space, and potentially to also offer a sort of a third approach to some of the countries that might be in a position where they feel like they need to choose sides. So I hope we also have some time remaining for additional questions. I tried to be short in this last one.
Yeah, we have received a lot of questions. Thank you, Mattia. We have received a lot of questions for this panel, but I have to pick up just one because we are running out of time. So I have a question from Sean Van Eynort, considering what should we do regarding the governance of outer space when considering the considerable potential for private actors moving to resource extraction and other businesses ventures in outer space, which current laws do not really cover in any detail. The question is, how can we prepare to manage the developments, these developments effectively, and preventing a sort of financial and legal Wild West in space? Professor, you can start.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would need 24 hours, but I'll try to be quick and brief. First of all, when we talk about treaties and so how to apply international space law, it's extremely important to mention and to remind everyone that the private players have to be in line with their own authorities, so the authorities of their own countries, which by definition should be in line with international space law when we talk about treaties. Clearly, when we talk about instead the guidelines, like the long-term sustainability guidelines, which have been approved back in 2019, well, this part is not mandatory, even if most of the countries, at least the big spacefaring countries, are trying always to follow and trying to be committed to the guidelines too, even if they are not mandatory. In principle, if we look at the Outer Space Treaty, we have to remind ourselves that it's crystal clear the fact that appropriation is not on the table, which means that no one can appropriate or can use resources for its own benefit. Now, it's true, it was mentioned several times here, but in every discussion I heard and I continue to hear, the fact is that the treaties have been approved a long time ago, and the situation was completely different. The number of players was lower, etc., etc. Still, the main point is that the responsible are the countries and not the private players. The private players have to follow. Instruction of resources is clearly one of the, trendy topics, because technology is advancing quickly. And so this may imply that we collectively, the space community, may be able to extract resources quite soon. From a technological perspective, it can be done soon. What I always advocate and continue to advocate also in my new role now is that we do need a multilateral decision process in place. Member states are, in my opinion, fully aware of the issue. In particular, if we look not necessarily at asteroid mining, which may come a little bit, on the medium term as a reality, but if we look at the moon exploration programs everywhere in the world, well, probably this is an area where we have to focus first. And so I'm quite sure that next year at the Summit of the Future called by the UN Secretary General in September, since this topic is in the agenda, so global governance and space traffic management in particular, I'm sure that member states will arrive very well prepared, and I hope that at least the main principles for a future global governance regime will be approved. So I'm very positive, and I hope that this will be the case.
Thank you, Professor. MATIJA, if you want to comment also.
Yeah, I mean, I will be very quick because I know we are pressured with time, but I would say a few things. I think I agree fully with most of the things Professor Pippo said. I think the Summit for the Future is one of these occasions where I think certain steps that can define and chart the future can and should take place. When she mentions multilateral systems, I think we can also remind ourselves of the Moon Agreement, which we know does not have many state parties, and but is nevertheless a treaty that was at one point negotiated and drafted and also approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations. And there is an explicit provision stating that when it comes to exploitation, there should be an international regime established, including appropriate procedures to govern the exploitation of natural resources of the moon. And then maybe finally, I think the one aspect, if we go to the very beginning of our session here, is that in this context, I think when economic prospects come into play, it will also be increasingly important to involve in one way or another, perhaps not at the same level as member states, but to also involve industry into these discussions, because I think it's inevitable that industry will play a bigger role, especially in the exploitation. part. So I think increased uptake of industry views and industry participation in multilateral discussions is also something that will benefit everyone in the long term.
Thank you, MATIJA. So a big thank to Professor Di Pippo and to Dr. RENČELJ for this very interesting discussion and for giving us their perspective and insights. And thanks to the audience, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.